Hi, everyone. Welcome to Community Conversations. Thanks for joining us. Next week, I want to notify you our series continues with Tana Engdahl. She is the elder of and spiritual leader of the Cowlitz tribe, and she's going to be presenting Cowlitz tribe, the Forever People. That will be at 12 noon in our Zoom room. Thank you very much. And this week, we're very pleased to welcome an old friend of mine. This is Roy Vu. Dr. Roy Vu is a historian from Dallas College, North Lake campus. He received his PhD from the University of Houston in 2006 and teaches courses on US history, Asian American history, and immigration history. He is the author of numerous articles and chapters like Feasted Landscapes, Sustainability in American Topics, and Our Finite Bounty, an anthology of sustainability topics. And he has a forthcoming book from Texas A&M Press entitled Far to Freedom, sorry about that, Vietnamese Americans and Their Home Gardens. Look for that next year. Please welcome Dr. Roy Vu.
Thank you, Courtney, for the wonderful invitation, wonderful introduction, and I appreciate the invitation as well. So I'm glad to be part of this wonderful speaker series. So it's great to be here virtually. The title of my presentation is Fighting Exclusion and Perpetual Foreignism, Asian Pacific Americans and Civil Rights. This presentation will briefly cover the history of Asian Pacific Americans and the struggles with civil rights and social justice, civil rights, equality, and social justice in the United States. Consequently, Asian Pacific American freedom fighters lived the American dream by challenging and transforming our country to be a more inclusive and perfect union. To start off, I will begin with Asian immigrants in the United States in the 19th century. There would be several push factors on why Asian immigrants would leave their respective home countries. For instance, rural poverty, famine, colonialism, which includes European colonialism and then later on Japanese colonialism, and war, not just foreign wars, but also civil wars. In regards to the United States, since this focuses on the Asian diaspora in the US, what would make the United States an attractive nation to immigrate in 19th century and later on 20th century? Well, there are several pull factors. For instance, economic agricultural opportunities. If you are a Japanese immigrant farmer living in Japan, you look at the United States in terms of the agricultural opportunities, right? With the abundance of land available, particularly fertile land in California and the West Coast. In addition, another good part of US industrialization and capitalism in the 19th century and so on, there's this constant need for cheap, unskilled workers, particularly in the US agricultural, mining, and railroad industries. Furthermore, you have the California gold rush of 1849. So once news broke out that gold was discovered in Northern California, you have immigrants all over the world, including from China, making their way to the United States in hopes of striking it rich quickly. Now, labor brokers, though, would also tell tall tales about the wealth of America to persuade immigrants to immigrate to the United States and become part of the growing labor of cheap workers, right? Growing force of cheap workers, excuse me. And so labor brokers would mythologize the United States as well. And for Chinese immigrants, before the arrival in the US, hearing such tall tales and myths, they called the United States of America Gold Mountain, thinking that they could come to the United States, work hard for a few years, make lots of money, and eventually return to their homeland. But in reality, immigrants from Asia as well as all over the world, when they arrive in the United States, they'll come to a quick realization that life will be rather difficult in the US. And so they would struggle mightily for years. And as a result, many would stay in the US much longer than anticipated and even stay permanently, okay? That said, you do see, like today and back in the 19th century, immigrants and refugees making contributions to the building of America. One of the most notable examples would be the completion of the first transcontinental railroad by immigrant labor, Irish immigrants from the East and Chinese immigrants from the West, completing the first transcontinental railroad at Promontory Point, Utah on May 10, 1869. Now, let me just show you a few photos of Chinese railroad workers who played a pivotal role in the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, risking their lives, working in dangerous conditions, and being paid very low. Nevertheless, many would partake the job opportunities available in the railroad industry, as well as agricultural and mining industries. Okay. Regards to Chinese immigrants, as well as other Asian immigrants, they'll find ways to maintain a part of their culture and maintain cultural continuity, despite, again, the harsh working conditions, the poor wages, and the racial discrimination violence that were ongoing. So they would carve out their own spaces, right? There's what I would say in between or interstitial spaces where they could recreate their own homeland in America, right? Since they weren't being perceived as Americans, but rather foreigners and perpetual foreigners even. Since they were most likely going to stay in the United States, they're going to try to bring some of their old homeland culture with them and retain the important aspects of their own culture, such as foodways and language and music, etc. All right. So with Chinese and Japanese immigrants coming to the United States in appreciable numbers for the first time during the late 19th century, you're going to see a backlash, unfortunately. Most Chinese immigrants came from Canton and South China, a region of great rural poverty. And again, they worked in railroads and in mines throughout the West, and as farm laborers in California. Many would eventually settle in cities such as San Francisco, where they established residential enclaves referred to as Chinatowns. The Chinese population in the U.S. peaked about 125,000 in 1882, just right before the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Excuse me. Japanese began immigrating to the U.S. in significant numbers in the late 1880s, driven by, again, a land shortage that was even more acute than that in Europe. The first wave came by way of Hawaii to work on farms in California, taking the place of Chinese workers who had moved to the cities. By 1900, there were some 50,000 Japanese immigrants in the United States, nearly all on the West Coast. The type of work available to immigrants depended on their skills, the local economy, and local discrimination, unfortunately. So what you see is the return of nativism. When immigrants revived after the Civil War, when immigration revived after the Civil War, so did anti-foreignism. But late 19th century nativism differed in two ways from its antebellum predecessor. First, the target was no longer Irish Catholics, but even more numerous Catholics and Jews of Southern and Eastern Europe, people whose languages and usually darker complexions set them apart from the native-born majority. Second, late 19th century nativism had a pseudoscientific underpinning. There was, in its view, a natural hierarchy of race. At the top, with the exception of the Irish, were Northern Europeans, especially those of Anglo-Saxon descent. Following below them were French, Slavs, Poles, Italians, Jews, Asians, Hispanics, and Africans. Social Darwinism, which justified the class hierarchy, reinforced scientific racism. Such sentiments generate proposals to restrict foreign immigration. The treatment of Chinese provided a precedent. Chinese immigrants had long worked for low wages under harsh conditions in mining and railroad construction in the West. Their different culture and their willingness to accept low wages provoked resentment among native and European-born workers. In fact, Asians were perceived as yellow peril, in other words, as competition for labor, competition for jobs. In addition, they were considered to be devious and not trustworthy, and to be lecherous, and also to be carriers of diseases. All right, so a racist trope that continues to persist to this very day, unfortunately. So as a result, you're going to see an increase in violence against Asian immigrants. For instance, increase in violence against Chinese laborers during the 1860s, 1870s. You have formation of organizations, racist organizations, anti-Asian organizations, such as the Asiatic Exclusion League. No need to elaborate there. And in addition, unfortunately, you're going to see racial violence in the West. Just to give you one example out of many, you have the Rock Springs Massacre that took place in 1885. Now, just to go back a little bit, in 1870, more than a quarter of Idaho's population and nearly 10% of Montana's was Chinese. So you have a sizable Chinese population in the West. Where there were numerous, the Chinese built their own communities and maintained their customs, but racism and fear of economic competition sparked hostility and violence against the Chinese almost everywhere. In Colorado, town leaders boasted of having driven all Chinese out of Leadville, Colorado by 1879. And white citizens destroyed Denver's Chinatown in 1880. The worst anti-Chinese violence occurred in Rock Springs, Wyoming in 1885, when white miners killed 28 unresisting Chinese miners drove away all 700 residents from the local Chinatown. This will be known as the Rock Springs Massacre. Although the members of the mob were well known, the grand jury, speaking for the white majority, found no cause for legal action. Such community sanction for violence against racial minorities made mob attacks one of the worst features of the mining camps. In addition, you're going to see the formation of detention centers or immigration stations in the United States to curb the influx of Asian immigrants as well as immigrants from the rest of the world from coming to the United States. For instance, you have the establishment of the Angel Island Immigration Station in San Francisco Bay of California. It was established in 1910 as an immigration station and will continue to exist until 1940. And Angel Island was considered to be the Ellis Island of the West. However, there was one significant difference. At Angel Island, there was a rejection rate of 18%. By comparison, the rejection rate at Ellis Island fluctuated between 1 to 3%. So quite a sizable difference there. Now, the Angel Island Immigration Station functioned as both an immigration facility as well as a deportation facility, which some 175,000 Chinese and about 60,000 Japanese immigrants were detained under oppressive conditions, journeying from 2 weeks and up to 6 months before being allowed to enter the United States. So, poor living conditions at Angel Island Immigration Station. And for the immigrants, particularly Chinese immigrants who spent days waiting in chronic uncertainty, well, they would find ways to resist. In other words, find ways to not only mark their existence, but also protest. And they would do so by carving poetry on the walls of the barracks, or on the walls of the barrack rooms where they slept. And so you have numerous Chinese poems carved onto these walls, and later were preserved. And so just to give you one example out of many, this short Chinese poem here, I'll read to you. America has power, but not justice. In prison, we were victimized as if we were guilty. Given no opportunity to explain, it was really brutal. I bow my head in reflection, but there's nothing I can do. So obviously here, the author wrote about how the United States lacked social justice, right? Particularly since for these immigrants, they are being imprisoned for a long period of time. And again, waiting in chronic uncertainty about what's going to happen to them. Now, there were some people who would assist the immigrants on Angel Island. Most were Asian. Now, most of the immigrants on Angel Island were from Asia, but you did have immigrants from South America and Europe being detained there as well. And part of the progressive movement, right? You have a number of people, particularly church people, particularly women of Protestant middle-class background, wanting to improve the living conditions of immigrants. So just to give you one example, you have the Deaconess Catherine Marr. She would be referred to as the Angel of Angel Island by immigrants there because she would visit them often and provide them with basic necessities such as soap, shampoo, toothbrushes, etc., to just to lift their spirits and help them as much as she possibly could. And so she was, let me just backtrack. So she was embraced by the immigrants there, immigrants detained at Angel Island. Again, she would be referred to as the Angel Island. She would spend close to 30 years providing assistance to thousands of immigrants who were detained there, and will continue to assist immigrants in San Francisco even after 1940, when the administration building caught fire and closed, and that closed the immigration station. All right, now I'm going to show you a few images of anti-Asian, anti-Asian political cartoons, as well as a few images of Angel Island. Okay, so here are 3 images that depict the anti-Asian sentiment in late 19th century America. Of interesting note, the first one on the left you have a political cartoon titled The Wasp, and the caption at the bottom says, "What would we like to see?" And the Wasp character is holding an Italian immigrant on the left and the Chinese immigrant on the right. Okay, so in other words, in late 19th century and well into the 20th century, you have Italian immigrants as well as other European immigrants, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, being vilified as well. So it's not just Asian immigrants, but also immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe being vilified, attacked, and some even being lynched. All right, so you have anti-Chinese sentiment, anti-Asian sentiment running rampant and permeating throughout U.S. society, particularly in the West. Here's another political cartoon demonstrating the anti-Asian sentiment with the Chinese holding a sign, with the Chinese gentleman holding a sign, "Destroy women and children." So again, the Chinese were perceived to be the yellow peril, a foreign threat. And again, more images here of anti-Asian sentiment on display in newspapers, pamphlets, political cartoons, magazines, etc. Okay, and then a few images of Angel Island, okay, where again you have a higher rejection rate than you did at Ellis Island in New York. Here's a photo of Catherine Marr with Chinese women, again waiting to gain entrance to the United States. Another photo of Catherine Marr, the angel of Angel Island, here photographed with Asian immigrant children. All right, so now we're going to move on to selected Asian immigration laws and policies in late 19th and early 20th century United States. Now, before 1870, there was a precedent, and that precedent would be the Naturalization Act of 1790, a precedent to basically narrow the naturalization law and to make it difficult for immigrants to become naturalized citizens of the United States. So going back to Naturalization Act of 1790, the act restricted citizenship to any alien being a free white person who had been in the United States for 2 years. So in effect, that left out indentured servants, slaves, and women. This implied that Black and later Asian immigrants were not eligible to be naturalized. But it said nothing about the citizenship status of non-white persons born on American soil. So later on, you have the Naturalization Act 1870 passed during Reconstruction after the Civil War, after the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, with the 15th Amendment, with the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, and the 14th Amendment giving U.S. citizens protection under the law, and the 15th Amendment giving African American men the right to vote. So in the context of that, the Naturalization Act 1870 barred agents from U.S. citizenship. The federal law had restricted the right of naturalization to aliens who are either free white or of African nativity and descent. Okay. However, again, it barred agents from U.S. citizenship. A few years later, you had the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, self-explanatory. The act would be the first immigration law to ban people by race, and it would be renewed every 10 years. And the Exclusion Act banned the immigration of all laborers from China to the United States, and made visits to China, re-entry to the U.S. difficult and uncertain. In 1943, Congress did finally repeal the Chinese Exclusion Act in consideration of its ally in the Pacific Theater during World War II, thus ending 61 years of official exclusion. However, it came with a twist. The repeal of the Chinese Exclusion Act finally allowed Chinese to become naturalized citizens, but it continued to limit immigration from China to a mere 105 people a year. And then you have the California Alien Land Law in 1913, which prohibits aliens ineligible for citizenship, for instance, the Chinese, Japanese, from owning property in the state. So this law would provide the model for similar acts passed in other states. Excuse me. In 1920, later on in 1923, California would tighten the law even further, barring the leasing of land and land ownership by American-born children of Asian immigrant parents or by corporations controlled by Asian immigrants. And then you have the Cable Act of 1922, which, among other provisions, stripped women of their citizenship if they married men ineligible for citizenship, or in other words, if they married immigrants from Asia. And then you have the Immigration Act of 1924, which restricted the quotas even further to 2% of the full-born population of each nationality in the United States, based on the 1890 census. Furthermore, in regards to this topic, it excluded all classes of Chinese immigrants as well as other Asians. And then finally, you have the 1934 Titans Mcduffie Act, which provided independence for the Philippines. The Philippines were colonized by the United States up to then. It would provide independence for the Philippines on July 4th, 1946, but it would strip Filipinos of their status as U.S. nationals and severely restricted Filipino immigration by establishing an annual quota of 50. Moving on. So you have these racist legal policies enacted by U.S. state governments. So what to do, right? So for Asian immigrants, they're going to take action. Okay, so in other words, they're going to become active agents of history, right? And so they're going to seek ways, seek legal action, for instance, to gain civil rights, and in this case, gain U.S. citizenship. So I'm going to give you 3 examples of U.S. Supreme Court citizenship cases. The first one, United States versus Wong Kim Ark, 1898. Wong Kim Ark was born in San Francisco, California, 1873. His father, Wong Si-ping, and his mother, Wei Li, were immigrants from China. His father was a merchant and a member of the firm Kwang Sing and Company, based in the city of San Francisco. They were not eligible to become citizens of the United States. That has been the law since the Naturalization Act of 1790 and persisted with the Naturalization Act of 1870. So Wong Kim Ark's parents were not eligible for U.S. citizenship, even if they made the United States their permanent home. However, Wong Kim Ark was born in the United States. It was granted citizenship under the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Wong's parents moved to China, but Wong stayed in California, traveling to China to visit his parents on 2 separate occasions. His first trip to visit his parents seemed uneventful. He was granted entry upon his return to the U.S. in 1890. 4 years later, however, he was denied re-entry when the collector of customs claimed that Wong was not a citizen. Wong Kim Ark gained legal support from the Chinese 6 companies and fought his case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. At issue was whether or not his birth in San Francisco was enough to make him a citizen of the United States. Lawyers argued against Wong, claimed that since he was born to parents who were subjects of China, Wong was also a subject of China and was therefore not, in the words of the 14th Amendment, subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. It was therefore not a U.S. citizen. So Chinese born to Chinese nationalists, regardless of location, can claim citizenship in China if the birth is properly registered in China. China, like Japan, also grant citizenship based on bloodline. So for the United States, it also grants this provision with certain limitations, but the U.S. is primarily a country of citizenship by soil. Okay, so birthright citizenship. Lawyers defending the federal government claimed that Chinese citizenship trumped U.S. citizenship law in this case. However, the Supreme Court did not agree. The Supreme Court held in a 6-2 decision, that a child born in the United States to parents of foreign descent is a citizen of the United States. This follows classic English common law tradition and set down the most powerful precedent, birthright citizenship, in favor of equality of citizenship in U.S. history. So Wong Kim Ark won his case. Now, the next 2 cases, they would turn out not to be favorable for Asian immigrants. The first of the 2 here, Takeo Ozawa versus the United States, 1922. Takeo Ozawa was born in Kanagawa, Japan on June 15, 1875, and immigrated to San Francisco in 1894. As a schoolboy, he worked his way through various schools and graduated from Berkeley High School in California. He attended the University of California for 3 years until 1906, when he moved to Honolulu and settled down. He was fluent in English and practiced Christianity and worked for an American company. He was married to a Japanese woman who was educated in the U.S., not Japan, with whom he had 2 children. In his own legal brief, he argued that his skin was as white as or whiter than the average Caucasian, but more importantly, he underscored his personal beliefs. He wrote, quote, "My honesty and industriousness are well known among my Japanese and American friends. In name, Benedict Arnold was American, but at heart, he was a traitor. In name, I am not American, but at heart, I am a true American. End of quote. In other words, in every sense of the word, he was a model citizen if being fully assimilated was the test. The Supreme Court, however, ruled against him. Justice George Sutherland, who presided over the case, upheld the lower court ruling and declared Ozawa racially ineligible for citizenship, while acknowledging that the color test alone would result in an overlapping of races and a gradual merging of one into the other without any practical line of separation. It declared that the word white was synonymous with what is properly known as the Caucasian race. The court concluded that the Japanese could not be white since they were clearly of a race which is not Caucasian. Okay. All right. And then you have the following year, United States versus Bhagat Singh Thind. In this case, Supreme Court is going to reject citizenship for Asian Indians, declaring that not all Caucasians are white. Okay. Bhagat Singh Thind, to talk about him briefly, was born in Punjab and came to America in 1913. A year later, he was paying his way through the University of California at Berkeley by working in an organ lumber mill during summer vacations. When America entered World War I, he joined the U.S. Army. He was honorably discharged on the 16th of December, 1918, and in 1920, applied for U.S. citizenship from the state of Oregon. So several applicants from India had thus far been granted U.S. citizenship. He too was approved by the district court. However, a naturalization examiner appealed this court's decision. So in its decision, in the case of U.S. versus Bhagat Singh Thind, the Supreme Court deemed Asian Indians ineligible for citizenship because U.S. law allowed only free whites to become naturalized citizens. The courts conceded that Asian Indians, were Caucasians, and that anthropologists considered them to be of the same race as white Americans. We're talking about late 19th and early 20th century scientific studies here, but argued that the average man knows perfectly well that there are unmistakable and profound differences. So only in 1946 did Congress pass a new law that allowed Asian Indians to become citizens and also established a small immigration quota. But major immigration to the United States from South Asia did not begin until after immigration laws were sharply revised in 1965. So in both cases, the Ozawa and the Thind cases, you see a circuitous argument being made, right, by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so as a result, you have, unfortunately for Asian immigrants struggling to become U.S. citizens, their cases would be rejected. Okay. All right. We're going to move on to Asian American organizations and some success stories. Okay, so I'll give you 3 examples in this case. So while all that's going on, Asian Pacific Americans would seek ways to organize and form organizations to assist them and to basically make life more meaningful and more honorable and desirable for themselves. And so there were 4 organizations to protect their civil rights and advocate for social justice. So you have the formation of Filipino labor unions, for instance. You also have some individual success stories. Now we're talking about a modicum of success here. All right. So in other words, despite their success, Asian Americans would also, for those who were thriving, they would continue to face racial discrimination and violence. So let me give you 2 success stories, and then I'll talk about the Filipino labor unions. The first one, George Shima. His real name is Ushijima Kenji, but in the United States, upon arriving, he would go by George Shima. Now, in regards to George Shima, he was a Japanese immigrant. Now, the Japanese came to Los Angeles around 1900. But they were forced into sectors of the economy that native-born white Americans had either shunned or failed to exploit. So the Japanese would turn this discrimination to their benefit when they transformed the cultivation market garden crops into a major agricultural enterprise, and George Shima was one of them. By 1904, Japanese farmers owned more than 50,000 acres in California. George Shima, who came to California from Japan in 1889 with little money, very little capital, eventually made himself the potato king of the Sacramento Delta. By 1913, Shima owned 28,000 acres of farmland. So he was quite wealthy. Nevertheless, he would face racial discrimination. For instance, his daughters who met the qualifications to gain interest into Stanford University were denied admission to Stanford University because of their Asian descent. Shima and his family had to leave an all-white neighborhood. In other words, they were expelled from the neighborhood, and so they had to relocate and find another home. So in other words, George Shima was not immune to racial discrimination despite his wealth and success. Now, I'm going to move on to Anna May Wong, and then I'll go back to Filipino labor unions. So I'm sorry, it's a little bit out of order here. Anna May Wong was an actress. She was born in Los Angeles to second-generation Chinese Americans in 1905. She would be the first Asian American female movie star. Her long, varied career spanned silent and sound film, stage, radio, and television, in an era when Chinese protagonists in Hollywood movies were typically performed by white actors in yellow face. The first woman to buck this trend, Wong starred in classics such as The Toll of the Sea, produced in 1922, at a young age of 17. She would also star in Douglas Fairbanks' The Thief of Baghdad in 1924, and Shanghai Express in 1932, in which her sexually charged scenes with Marlene Dietrich fed rumors about a lesbian relationship. Wong was never married in her lifetime, by the way. So these are rumors. These aren't, of course, confirmed facts. But nevertheless, for Wong, she was considered to be a bold, progressive Asian American woman who was advocating for more and better representation of Asian Americans on film. Wong did leave Hollywood for Europe in the late 1920s because she was frustrated by the stereotypical roles in which she was often typecast as either a victim, Madame Butterfly, or as a dragon lady victimizer. Her career was also limited by American anti-miscegenation laws, which prevented her from sharing an on-screen kiss with any person of another race. Okay, so let me jump forward here to the image of George Shima, whom I discussed earlier, and Anna May Wong. Again, Anna May Wong would be the first Asian American female movie star, starring in numerous films from the 1920s and on. Okay. Now I'm going to move on to Filipino labor unions. Okay, so as far as organization, you have Filipino immigrants arriving in the United States, and again, being part of the cheap immigrant labor force. And by 1930, the Filipino population in the U.S. mainland reached over 45,000. This represents a nine-fold increase since 1920, when the Filipino population numbered roughly 5,600. In 1930, most of the Filipinos on the U.S. mainland, about 60%, worked in agriculture. In 1930, Filipino, Mexican, and white farm workers and white pack and share workers went on strike against Imperial Valley. Imperial Valley would be a major lettuce grower in California. The strikers organized the Agriculture Workers Industrial League, the AWIL. Allied with the growers, the government authorities broke the strike. So the government, California government, made an alliance with Imperial Valley, and they broke the strike by arresting over 100 workers. Later that same year, in Watsonville, California, riots broke out, in which white farmers attacked Filipino farm workers. In 1933, after the American Federation of Labor refuses to organize a union on their behalf, Filipino lettuce pickers, led by Filipino labor leaders, formed the Filipino Labor Union in the Salinas Valley. The Filipino Labor Union in the Salinas Valley led a one-day strike to protest a 20-cent an hour wage. Growers easily put down a strike by bringing in replacement laborers. But the Filipino Labor Union would not give up. Okay, they're going to persist. In 1934, the Filipino Labor Union led Filipino lettuce workers in the Salinas Valley in a strike, extracting concessions of wages of 40 cents an hour and recognition as a legitimate farm workers union for the lettuce growers. The American Federation of Labor in 1936 finally chartered Field Workers Union Local Number 30326, a combined Mexican-Filipino agriculture union. So it wasn't until 1936 when Filipinos and Mexicans could join the American Federation of Labor. In March 1938, 2 years later, the Filipino Agricultural Labor Association is founded by Stockton asparagus farm workers. In the following year, 1939, they successfully extracted concessions of wage increases. So through resilience and persistence and preservation, Filipino labor unions would succeed in gaining some concessions. So once more, you have Asian Americans getting organized and forming labor unions, as well as other organizations such as the Japanese American Citizens League. I mentioned the Chinese Six Companies, but I won't go into great detail about those organizations. Moving on to the internment of Japanese Americans. So on December 7, 1941, the day which would live in infamy, Japanese forces attacked U.S. forces at Pearl Harbor, killing approximately 2,500 U.S. servicemen and destroying several U.S. naval ships as well. Following Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt and U.S. Congress, the United States, would push U.S. Towards entrance into World War II and declare war against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, Imperial Japan, and Fascist Italy. And so the United States would finally join World War II in support of the Allies, okay, against the Axis powers. Now, with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, you're going to see a backlash, unfortunately, against Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans back home in the United States. Okay, same thing happened during World War I, for instance, when Germany was perceived as the main enemy, and so as a result, unfortunately, German immigrants and Americans were attacked and vilified back home in the United States. So immediately after Pearl Harbor, or just less than a month, you're going to see President Franklin Roosevelt in early 1942 issuing Executive Order 9066, which deemed Japanese Americans as enemy aliens and therefore authorized the military to evacuate 112,000 Japanese Americans from the Pacific coast and forced them to relocate to 10 internment camps. These internment camps were military prison camps and were located in Western California, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, Montana, and Arkansas. So with the incarceration of Japanese Americans, let me show you a few images here of anti-Japanese sentiment, as well as Japanese Americans being rounded up and being placed into internment camps. Here you have an obvious racist sign here. And then you have, as far as Japanese American internees, being tagged and being forced to relocate to internment camps, where they would be placed on board trains that would first take them to assembly centers, and then they would be relocated to internment camps. And then another photo. So despite the discrimination and hatred towards Japanese Americans, you can see clearly Japanese Americans here would remain loyal to the United States. And you can see Japanese Americans join the U.S. military in World War II and fight against the Axis powers. And in fact, with the military, our branches of the military still segregated, the Japanese American soldiers would be segregated as well. And so you have an all Japanese American regiment that would be one of the most decorated U.S. combat units in World War II, and that would be the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. So this unit was the most decorated U.S. combat unit in World War II. And this all Japanese American regiment served in Europe and Africa while fighting for the United States overseas. Back home, of course, the U.S. government, again, deemed Japanese Americans as enemy aliens and prisoner in internment camps during the war. So while these Japanese American men were fighting overseas, guess what? Back home, their family members, siblings, and loved ones were imprisoned, right? Imprisoned behind barbed wire and under heavy guard. And so for Japanese Americans, they were fighting a double victory, right? A victory abroad against foreign enemies, against the Axis powers, in hopes that would translate to victory at home against racial discrimination and violence. Okay. So you have Japanese American soldiers fighting in World War II and serving the U.S. Military forces and making, of course, sacrifices, right? Sacrificing their lives despite the ongoing racial discrimination and internment against their loved ones. Okay. In addition to that, this is what I'm been focused on lately. As Courtney mentioned earlier, I'm currently working on a book project titled Farm to Freedom, Vietnamese Americans and Home Gardens. So this got me interested in looking into Asian immigrants and their own home gardens as well, including Japanese American victory gardens. So one measure of Japanese American attorneys' resilience and desire to return to normalcy, where they have spaces of control and sovereignty, even while they were victimized, is how they cultivated their citizenship. Gardening became an act or a way of remembering their former lives. The act of digging in the dirt to cultivate organic produce became an act of remembrance, as well as a symbol of food resistance. Regarding Japanese American food gardens raised and crafted at desolate internment camps, historian Gary Okihiro poignantly analyzes, quote, "For many, the act of creating restored a semblance of self-control and self-determination. Describing one's traces upon the intractable earth helped to dispel the threatening darkness. Gardens transformed the desert into places of beauty. Even the hostile alkaline soil could not resist this labor of love. Using sticks, stones, and native trees, shrubs, cacti, and wildflowers, Japanese Americans landscaped their blocks and erected hedges and facades around their barracks to shield their dwellings from the dust storm, and splashed the pitiful tar paper barracks and bleak surroundings with mental color and light." Okay. Okihiro astutely sums up the driving force and significance behind the works of Japanese American internees. Creativity, quote, "Creativity is important to remember, surged despite the paralysis of rejection and confinement." So here's a photograph of a Japanese American woman at a internment camp planting her garden. Just to give you some scale, in the background, you have the barracks, and further back, the mountains. So again, these internment camps were typically located in desolate areas on the west. But you can see the size of their gardens, right, at these internment camps. And so they would cultivate these beautiful, lush gardens. Unfortunately, you can't see this in a black and white photo, but nevertheless, they would cultivate numerous crops, vegetables and herbs and fruit trees that they would later, of course, consume and therefore improve their diet and nutrition, but also boost their morale. Now I'm going to move on to the Mitsuye Endo case. Mitsuye Endo was a Japanese American attorney. Okay, so she was placed in prison in an internment camp. She was the plaintiff in a landmark lawsuit that ultimately led to the closing of the concentration camps and the return of Japanese Americans to the West Coast in 1945. It's one of the most important cases in the United States concerning the rights of Japanese American citizens. Since one concerning the rights of Japanese American citizens, excuse me. Executive Order 9066 allowed the United States government to detain Americans with Japanese ancestry during the time of war. But Executive Order 9066 was challenged in 1942 by Mitsuye Endo, the only female to resist against the executive order. Ms. Endo was contacted by a civil liberties attorney named James Purcell while she was detained at the Tule Lake concentration camp in Northern California. Purcell wanted Ms. Endo to challenge the case, and he helped her file a habeas corpus petition in 1942. Now, habeas corpus is a writ requiring a person under arrest to be brought before a judge or into court, especially to secure the person's release unless lawful grounds are shown for their detention. Okay. After the petition was filed, it was denied by the court 1 year later, and Ms. Endo was transferred to the Central Utah Relocation Center in Topaz, Utah. After she arrived at the relocation center, she filed an appeal with the Circuit Court of Appeals, and the case eventually went before the Supreme Court. During her case, the Supreme Court ruled that the government could not continue to detain Mitsuye Endo in a concentration camp because she posed no danger to the United States. The decision by the Supreme Court allowed Japanese Americans to return to the West Coast and resettle. However, despite the return home, well, backtrack a little bit. For Japanese Americans, many of them, when they were being rounded up and being forced to relocate, they had to sell their home properties or their farms quickly and for a much lower price. So unfortunately, they would lose their homes and properties. those who managed to maintain their homes and properties, well, as you can see in this photo, when they returned, they were obviously not always welcomed. Okay, so the racial discrimination and anti-Asian sentiment would continue to persist. All right. Now, after World War II, World War II would change a few things, okay, particularly with the dawning of the Cold War. You have U.S. immigration policy changes, okay? Cold War politics would basically force U.S. policymakers to change immigration policies. The U.S. couldn't afford to appear contradictory, right, in its principle of equality, freedom, and democracy in the midst of the Cold War against Soviet communism. In addition to that, you have more and more Asian Americans speaking out after World War II. So you have the rise of the Asian American movement, which was spurred on by the ongoing civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. So the civil rights movement would help spur other social movements like the Asian American movement, as well as the Chicano movement and the American Indian movement, and so on. In regards to legislation, you have the passage of the Luce-Seller Act of 1946, which extended the right to become naturalized citizens to Filipinos and Asian Indians. But the immigration quota will be set at 100 people a year. In 1953, you have the Refugee Relief Act, which would extend refugee status to non-Europeans. And then the landmark 1965 Immigration Nationality Act. This act finally repealed the racist national origins quota system, racist and restrictive, and gives priority to family reunification. So from 1965 on, after the passage of this landmark act, you can see a dramatic increase in immigrants from Asia as well as Latin America. And then you have the Refugee Act of 1980, enacted in response to the boat people fleeing Vietnam. The act would grant asylum to politically oppressed refugees. And then finally, Immigration Act of 1990, just give you one more example, you have this act increased the number of immigrants allowed to the United States each year to 700,000. So again, you can see that the immigration policies would reflect more of the civil rights era, right, of the 1950s and 1960s. And again, in part, this was not only due to the political activism of civil rights leaders and activists, but also, again, in the midst of the Cold War, right, the United States could not prove to be contradictory, right, in its Cold War against Soviet Union. All right, so moving on to Asian Pacific Americans in the late 20th century. So here's ongoing Asian American movement. In fact, the term Asian American was first coined in 1968 by UC Berkeley students who were inspired by the Black Power movement. And the civil rights movement introduced new ways to think about justice and equality in the United States. Asian American leaders drew inspiration from and provided support for Black freedom fighters. For example, after Japanese Americans were seen as threats and sent to internment camps during World War II, that community offered support to civil rights leaders trying to repeal the Emergency Detention Act over concerns that Black activists could be subject to the same kind of treatment. Also, Asian American students rally alongside Black student organizers and other ethnic student groups as part of the Third World Liberation Front at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley in the late 1960s, which culminated in student strikes that led to equal education opportunities and the creation of ethnic studies programs. Activists like Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs not only pulled insights from Black radical frameworks for Asian American liberation, but were also strong and active advocates for Black social justice movements. So I'll share you a couple of photos here. Grace Lee Boggs to the left and Yuri Kochiyama on the right. Moving on to the 1982 murder of Vincent Chin. Okay, the Vincent Chin case would be the first federal civil rights trial for an Asian American. On the night of June 19, 1982, the night of his bachelor party, Vincent Chin was beaten to death with a baseball bat by two white auto workers in Detroit. Ronald Evans was a foreman at Chrysler at the time, and his stepson, Michael Nitz, was a recently laid off auto worker. This happened during the height of anti-Japanese sentiment. The American auto industry was reeling at the time due to increased competition with Japanese import cars and mass layoffs happening across the country. So things were looking bleak, particularly in Michigan, home to the big three, Ford, Chrysler, and GM. Vincent Chin was beaten in the head so badly, he lapsed into a coma and died 4 days later. Before he lost consciousness, he whispered 3 words to one of the friends who had been out with him that night, quote, "It's not fair." Hence, as you see, after his death, you have mass protests by Asian American activists being supported by the likes of civil rights activists such as Jesse Jackson. So "it's not fair" became the rallying cry for justice for Vincent Chin and his family. Vincent was buried the day after what should have been his wedding day. The first trial was presided over by Judge Charles Kaufman. He gave both Evans and Nitz 3 years probation, fined them $3,000 and court costs, and released them. He later said they weren't the kind of men you send to jail. Citing the fact that neither man had a previous record, Kaufman said that he just didn't think putting them in prison would do any good for them or for society. That you don't make the punishment fit the crime, you make the punishment fit the criminal. Judge Kaufman's lenient sentencing angered not just Vincent Chin's family, but the entire Asian American community, led by activist Helen Zia. Several Asian American lawyers and community leaders banded together to create American Citizens for Justice. This grassroots advocacy organization rallied with several diverse groups, churches, synagogues, Black activists to protest Kaufman's sentencing. This inspired other Asian Americans across the country to hold their own demonstrations. These protests resulted in the first federal civil rights trial for an Asian American. In 1984, Ronald Evans and Michael Nitz were indicted on 2 counts of conspiracy and violating Vincent Chin's right to be in a place of public accommodation because of his race, and sentenced to 25 years. In the trial that followed the indictment, Nitz was cleared of all charges. Evans, who held the baseball bat, was convicted of violating Chin's civil rights and sentenced to 25 years. But due to accusations of alleged witness coaching, Evans was acquitted in the second trial held in 1987, in which his guilty conviction was reversed. He would ultimately be found not guilty, and he never spent a single day in jail. Now, in regards to Japanese American attorneys, there would be some redemption. In 1988, you have the passage of the Redress Act, excuse me. And this act provided $20,000 compensation to survivors of World War II internment of Japanese and Japanese Americans. Now, unfortunately, I skipped over the Vietnamese fishermen with the Ku Klux Klan. I do want to talk about that briefly as well, and then hopefully be able to showcase this trailer of the movie Sea Drift. In regards to Vietnamese fishermen, like earlier Asian immigrants, the Vietnamese refugees have felt the stings of racial slurs and violence in the late 1970s, early 1980s along the Texas Gulf Coast. Places like Sea Drift, Vietnamese fishermen were the targets of Ku Klux Klan demonstrations and threats. Competition between Vietnamese and white fishermen erupted in ugly confrontations and incidents of violence. Now, fortunately for the Vietnamese fishermen and the Vietnamese community, you have the Southern Poverty Law Center getting involved and taking legal action to protect the rights of Vietnamese fishermen, and they won their case in court, where Ku Klux Klan members were banned from being anywhere near close to Vietnamese fishermen in the Vietnamese community. This is after they had brandished weapons and guns and made threats of force to intimidate the Vietnamese fishermen and drive them out of Sea Drift and other towns along the Texas Gulf Coast. Now, let me try and see if I can showcase the trailer of Sea Drift. It's a 2-minute trailer, 2 minutes 11 seconds. So let's see if this shows. Okay. Hopefully, if not, that's right. I do want to mention that while we're waiting here, on PBS.org, the documentary Sea Drift, which is a fantastic documentary. I've seen it twice, and I met the director and producer and one of the Sea Drift natives who would play was featured prominently in this documentary, would be streamed for free on pbs.org. Okay, so here's the trailer.
Most of the people that live here, that's what they did to make a living.
It's not showing up. I'm hearing it, but not seeing it.
Oh, you're not seeing it?
No.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The first Vietnamese came to see them. They weren't really welcome into the
Okay, let me stop. I apologize. Well, if you have an opportunity, please, again, check out pbs.org. And you have, again, until April 30th for the free streaming of the entire documentary. I highly recommend it. It's a great documentary. And again, it highlights the violence and the unfortunate racial violence that would occur in the Texas Gulf Coast and the involvement of the Ku Klux Klan and their intimidation attacks against Vietnamese fishermen. Okay. All right. Since I'm sorry I'm running out of time here, so I apologize for making this presentation lengthy. Just real quickly, in regards to the 21st century, Asian Pacific Americans are becoming even more politically active and engaged. You have more Asian Pacific Americans in Congress. You have Kamala Harris, who's half Indian, half African American, and she's of course the vice president now. Before she was a senator from California. You also have Daniel Inouye, right, who passed away in 2011. He was a World War II veteran of Japanese descent, and he served loyally during World War II and became a U.S. senator later on. And so you have more and more Asian Pacific Americans in Congress. You also have Asian Pacific Americans getting involved in current social movements like Black Lives Matter. You also see, unfortunately, since last March, right, the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, you see the rise of anti-Asian violence. And most recently, unfortunately, in late March 2021, you had the Atlanta shootings where 8 people were murdered, 6 of whom were of Korean descent. So you have 6 Korean American women who unfortunately was murdered in the Atlanta shootings. And so you have Asian Pacific Americans getting involved and participating and organizing. And so if you wish to help, you wish to assist, or want to know more information, please feel free to check out hashtag Stop AAPI Hate, Asian American Pacific Islanders Hate, and visit the website, stopaapihate.org, and to show you a few more images here. You have Asians for Black Lives and the War on Black People. So you have Asian Americans getting involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. I love these 2 signs here. When Black lives are threatened, all of our lives are threatened. And on the right, my fellow Asian Americans, our Black brothers and sisters bore the burden for us so that most of us and our families would be here. Immigration Act of 1965. It's time for us to stand and bear the burden with them. Hashtag Black Lives Matter. Lei Huang Nguyen from Houston paid for this billboard, which would prove to be controversial within the Vietnamese community, but that's another story to tell another day. But again, he represents the Vietnamese American progressives who are participating in Black Lives Matter movement. And so you have this billboard in Houston, Black Lives Matter, in Southwest Houston, and the Vietnamese translation as well. And again, as far as Asian Pacific Americans, you have more and more Asian Pacific Americans speaking out. I'm not a virus. In this protest, fight the virus, not the people. I don't look American. You don't look Native. So I thought that sign was smartly done by this young Asian American woman. And finally, this beautiful mural after the Atlanta shootings, Black Lives Matter and Stop Asian Hate. So it's a beautiful mural painted. And in conclusion, for Asian Pacific Americans and their experience, on one hand, they're visible. For instance, they were visible as the enemy, right? The yellow peril, unfortunately. So they was discriminated. Yet sometimes they were invisible, where their accomplishments and contributions, not just to themselves, but to the United States and to our democratic society, were not well known. And so as a result, or were not even discussed in history textbooks. So they were invisible in that regard. And also, I mentioned being stuck in these in-between spaces or interstitial spaces where they're perceived not as U.S. citizens, but rather perpetual foreigners, right? But at the same time, for someone like me, second generation Vietnamese American, being neither American nor foreign, right? I know it's Vietnamese Americans are not being perceived as Americans or U.S. citizens, right, in the U.S. But at the same time, for second and third generation Vietnamese Americans, for instance, if we were to return to Vietnam, we would not be perceived as Vietnamese. I know it would be easily pointed out as being Americans or Việt kiều, Vietnamese outsiders, right? So as a result, you have these in-between or interstitial spaces that Vietnamese Americans and many other immigrant and refugee groups that would carve out for themselves to establish their own, in the case of Vietnamese Americans, Vietnamese American spaces, right? So of course, as far as the model E pluribus unum, right, out of many one, I would also argue that immigrants and refugees contribute toward a pluralist mosaic democracy. Okay, so we're not a homogenous society, and therefore we shouldn't expect a homogenous democracy, but rather a pluralist mosaic democracy. And for Asian Pacific Americans, we're building the American dream, even when unjustly excluded or imprisoned. We build our own version of the American dream. And keep in mind that there's a long history of fighting for civil rights beyond the civil rights era, before the civil rights era, and after the civil rights era, or I should say, the ongoing civil rights era that we continue to fight and struggle for civil rights, social justice, and inclusion today. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you for watching and listening. I appreciate your time. And I wish we could do a little Q&A session, but I understand due to technical difficulties, that will not happen. But feel free to send me emails of questions from anyone who would watch this presentation later on. And here's a list of further reading in case anyone's interested in reading more about Asian Pacific American history. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do have one question. If you have a moment, we could address it now. If not, I can email. Okay, great. So you mentioned that Angel Island had a higher rejection rate than Ellis Island did, significantly higher from what it sounded like to me. Do you think a lot of that has to do with ideas about disease and contagion? Like in Nyan Shah's work, he talks about contagious divides in San Francisco at the turn of the 20th century. And of course, those signs at the end about I am not a virus really sort of reinforce that to me. Do you have any evidence of what those rejection numbers were about?
Right. So they would, for instance, and they would probe, or they'll have, for instance, physicians probing and prodding Asian immigrants upon their arrival, and they'll go through these rigorous tests where they would see if Asian immigrants have any hookworms and other possible diseases. So it would, in other words, for Asian immigrants on Angel Island, they were basically put through the ringer, right? Where they were more tested, and they were detained for a longer period of time. And so as a result, consequently, you're going to see that for unfortunately for Asian immigrants, anything of possible suspect that they were carrying some kind of a disease would lead to their, unfortunately, their removal, right? And so their repatriation, right? So as a result, that's why you have such a higher rejection rate at Angel Island versus, say, at Ellis Island. Now that said, things would change for European immigrants, right? As you know, during the 1920s, with the Immigration Act of 1921 and 1924. So European immigrants would also, unfortunately, be targeted and be vilified, right, during the 1920s.
Yeah, and that makes perfect sense. And especially you saying that it's a longer period of detainment, that's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, because then, of course, epidemic disease can spread even more. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. All right, and I really do appreciate you coming in and dealing with all of the difficulties that we face today and sharing your knowledge with us. And please, everybody else, please join us again next week. We'll be back on the webinar and hopefully have everything squared away. But take care. Thank you, Roy. Clap, 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 clap. And we will talk to you later.
Appreciate it.
Thank
yes,
you.
absolutely. Thanks so much again for allowing me to be part of this wonderful speaker series. I appreciate it.